So we're still celebrating the month of March as Ghana Month. Now, the business of banking in Ghana can be traced to the colonial era in the then Gold Coast. This period saw the provision of financial services to mainly British enterprises and the colonial administration. In 1896, the first bank to open a branch in Accra was the Bank of British West Africa, which later became Standard Chartered Bank. Since then, the face of banking in the colonial and post-colonial era has undergone some drastic changes. What can history tell us as we celebrate Ghana Man? Philip Namfuri will walk us through some history of the banking sector. Philip, give us a chronology of this.
So, like you rightly mentioned, Standard Chartered First Bank, 1896.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Formerly known as British?
Yeah, Bank of British West Africa.
Okay.
So their orientation at that time, with their predisposition, was to service the local industries. Then, as time went on, 1896, Standard Chartered Bank came. Then, in 1916, Barclays Bank also came. At that time, it was called Colonial Bank. So at that time,
So those were the two countries, the two banks.
Those were the only two banks in the Gold Coast at that time. And for the longest time, these were the only two banks that were existing in Ghana. So Standard Chartered, Barclays Bank. And now Barclays is ABSA in Ghana and then Africa. They still maintain their Barclays brand in the UK.
All right.
So the business of banking, like we said, traced back to the colonial era. Banks existed to serve British enterprises and the colonial administration. That's one. Then 1896, we had the first bank, that's Standard Chartered. Then we had 1918, Colonial Bank began operations in the Gold Coast. Then at that time, they realized that, you know what, it was only these two banks that were operating, Standard Chartered, Barclays Bank. Then people started agitating. Then we established what we have today as GCB. So that's Ghana Commercial Bank. Was the third bank to be established in this country in 1953. Then
that was just before independence.
Just before independence. Then out of GCB, we carved out the Bank of Ghana, or Bank of Ghana, let's say, was established on its own also in 1957. It was established 2 days just before independence. So Bank of Ghana's birthday is actually 4th March 1957. So Standard Chartered, then from Standard Chartered, we moved to Barclays Bank. Then from Barclays Bank, we moved to Ghana Commercial Bank. Then we moved to the Bank of Ghana in 1957. So at that time, just at independence, more or less, let's call it 4 banks. Then after independence, there was a drive to create more banks focused on the Ghanaian enterprises also.
All right.
Then after that, Nkrumah's agitation to ramp up the financial sector saw the establishment of some banks. So we had Agricultural Development Bank, as we can see here, 1965. We also had NIB in 1963. All these were what we call development finance institutions or development banks.
Okay. Now, so what were the peculiar issues at that time? Because, every now and then we have the focus of banks. At that time, post-colonial or pre-colonial era, what was the focus?
So pre-colonial era, I beg your pardon, was to service only the British enterprises. You and I were excluded from the system. So there was agitation, and then they realized that, you know what, we need local banks. We need banks that can focus on not only British enterprises, but the Ghanaians also in the Gold Coast at that time. So that was the drive at that time.
So does it mean that at that time, not many Ghanaians had bank accounts, so to speak?
You may have a bank account, but it will be with the foreign institutions. So the banking sector at that time was foreign dominated. As was the debate in the recent banking sector cleanup when people were complaining that our banks are the banking industry is being taken over by the foreign entities. At that time, just these two banks were operating. Then as time went on, Nkrumah brought these new development finance institutions. Then in the 80s and the 90s, we had the introduction of privately owned commercial banks. So you talk about your Cow Bank, we talk about Eco Bank, the Trust Bank, which was acquired by Cow Bank. We had Meridian Bank, which was also in 1995 acquired by the Social Security and National Insurance Trust at that time. Then we also had the Metropolitan and Allied Bank, which has also been, over time, more or less acquired by another institution. Banks such as Home Finance Company, HFC, which is now Republic Bank, were all in the system at that time.
Okay. So each of these banks had a focus, a special area that it was actually...
So in that time, from colonial era up to when we introduced the universal banking license, somewhere in 2004, banks were operating on 3 lines. Either you're a development bank, you're a merchants bank, or you're a commercial bank. So you focus your industry. Then with time, after the passage of this new banking act, the one that introduced a universal banking license, all the banks said that you can play in any space you want to play. But if you if you look at this, for example, so you see the colonial era, limited banking services, the banks were controlled from London. What were the constraints at that time? Exclusion, agitation. Then we came to Nkrumah's time, right after independence. State-owned control banks, development banking, interest rate ceilings and sector credit ceilings. They were trying to stimulate growth. So you find that banks can't lend above a certain limit or can't give loans to a certain sector beyond a certain limit. That led to what we call financial repression, a very fancy name that describes the chaos and the mess we created in the system at that time. Then we came down into the structural adjustment era. That was when Ghana experienced its own economic crisis, and then the World Bank, etc., came inside, and we had to change.
During the PNDC regime.
Exactly. Then we brought in the Financial Sector Adjustment Program, FinSAP, which was broken down into Financial Sector Adjustment Credit 1 and 2. These more or less established what we have today as some of the modern foundations of banking. So, for example, the establishment of the National Banking College came as a result of this FinSAC 2.
Okay.
Then we have the FinSEP 1 and then FinSEP 2. I'll leave this for now. Okay. But this is basically a snapshot of what Ghana's banking sector was like. We can find a write-up I put together on my JoyNews/business in the course of the day. So if viewers are interested, they can check it out. But it just gives you an idea that the banking sector has changed.
Evolved.
Yes, evolved over time. And this current 2017 to date has been one of the biggest shake-ups we've had in the industry. Banks have collapsed, banks have closed over time. But this one that we're seeing today, I think for me,
so within this period, I mean, have we learned any lessons? Are there any lessons, peculiar lessons that can be learned or that can be attributed to, I mean, as the industry continues to evolve?
Very good one. So, state-owned banks are good, but we need to learn from them. You see, at that time, a lot of the banks were state-owned, limited private-owned banks, or even no private-owned banks. And we saw the chaos it created. At some point, almost all of these banks almost went down. They were in some crisis whatsoever. So for one, I would say state-owned banks are good, but we must ensure that they are run properly like the private-owned banks. Not to suggest that private-owned banks can't collapse, but you know the influences a state-owned bank will bring to the banking space. People will not follow due process in taking credits, etc. So for us, I would say reducing the state's ownership in banks in the country is good. And now you see that international institutions, IMF, World Bank, have been advocating for a reduction in holdings of equity by government in banks. And you see that now there are very few government-owned banks, apart from CBG being 100% owned by the banks. Very few, most of them are privately owned banks. Yeah.
All right, so before we take a break, one interesting question that keeps bothering my mind. Why are we now still pursuing financial inclusion agenda? Why didn't we at that time, imbibe that conscience into the people to know that banking is a necessity?
Okay. So we did it at some point. If you look at this somewhere, you realize that there is the NBFI project, non-bank financial institutions project, that brought together savings and loans, microfinance institutions, etc. These were supposed to target people who were excluded from the financial system. But we've seen the effects of it in Ghana today. You've seen the mess the microfinance, microcredits issues have created. So these are what I was saying.
Corporate governance lapses?
Exactly. So these are learning curves. We have to continue. It's not a one-day affair. We have to continue with these as time goes on and learn from mistakes as we've done.
So from here, what's the way, when do you think, or where do you think we are heading to?
Okay, we're heading to a stronger banking sector, but it hinges upon our ability to ensure that the right things are done and we don't repeat mistakes of the recent crisis that we had from 2017 to date. Just make sure that all is well and good in the system.
Thank you very much, Philip Namfuri. And of course, it's all part of the Ghana month, celebrating the month of March as Ghana month. We're taking a short break on the marketplace. We'll be right back after this.